Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to see you. We were talking at lunch today what we should do after the Eternal Companion. I seem to be choosing very short devotional books. So if you have input, give me an email or a call or a text and with suggestions of something you would like to do. I'm contemplating, we were talking to Tibet, well, we'll take input first before we start discussing. Today we'll start on the Eternal Companion on page 81 in my 1960 edition. Page 81, Maharaj as Guru. And we've just finished the story of Maharaj having Swami Akhandananda walked around the compound of Bellarmont all night long and greeting him in the morning. This is how he did his teasing his brother disciples. The relationship between guru and disciple, according to the Hindu scriptures, is a very sacred one. Maharaj used to say that an enlightened soul must help his disciple until he also becomes enlightened. This tie cannot be broken by the death of the body. After the teacher has passed away, he still continues to watch over his disciples in spirit. He will not accept his own liberation until all are liberated. That is something really to think about, because your guru gave you instructions. You help them as well as yourself if you follow those instructions explicitly. Maharaj was the embodiment of the protective power of the guru. At one time, he was walking with another disciple and myself. He was slightly ahead of us. Suddenly, we heard a shout, "Out of the way! There's a mad bull!" An instant later, we saw the bull itself rushing towards us. There was no time to run. My brother disciple and I tried to get in front of Maharaj to protect him, but he raised his arms and pushed us back. Although he was now an elderly man, he was still extraordinarily strong. As the bull approached with lowered head, there was a moment's pause. Maharaj stood still, confronting it. Then the bull stopped, shook its head from side to side, lifted it, and walked away. Swami Akhandananda relates a similar incident which took place at Bhubaneswar. Bhubaneswar is in Orissa near Puri. And Maharaj loved Bhubaneswar. Maharaj had gone for an evening walk in the woods with Akhandananda and another devotee. By the time they turned homeward, it was dark. All at once they saw a leopard coming toward them. Maharaj stood still. The leopard also stopped about 100 feet away and looked at them for some moments. Then it turned and ran off. Neither of the devotees felt frightened. There could never be any fear in the presence of Maharaj. Maharaj prescribed various disciplines and diverse forms of worship to suit the different temperaments of his disciples. He knew our needs far better than we did. When I first joined the order, I was inclined toward the path of devotion, but Maharaj decided to send me to a monastery in the Himalayas where the ideal of non-dualism is practiced and no ritual is allowed. Before I left, he made me read aloud to him a book on extreme non-dualism. 2 years later, he sent me to the monastery in Madras, where ritual is regarded as very important. By this time, I had lost all my devotional inclination and no longer believed in ritualistic worship. Sometime later, Maharaj came to visit the monastery. One day, a devotee brought a large basket of Nagalingam flowers to be offered in the worship. Knowing that they were the favorite flowers of Maharaj, I arranged them in his room. Maharaj came in, saw what I was doing, and asked, "Have you saved some of the flowers for the worship of the Lord?" "No, Maharaj," I replied, for I had thought to myself, after all, the Lord in the shrine room is only a picture, but the Guru is the living God. Maharaj, as usual, read my thoughts and asked, "Do you think it is merely a picture that is worshipped in the shrine?" "Yes," I replied somewhat nervously. "Have you ever performed the ritualistic worship?" "No, Maharaj." "Why not?" "I am not yet a Swami, and I am not a Brahmin by caste, so I am not allowed to do the external worship in the shrine." Maharaj became quite excited. "What is all of this?" he exclaimed. "Call Sarvananda." Swami Sarvananda was a disciple of Maharaj and the head of the Madras monastery. When he appeared, Maharaj asked him, "How is it that a brahmachari of this order is not allowed to do the worship just because he is not a Brahmin?" Sarvananda answered, "Swami Ramakrishna Order was the first head of the monastery. He was very particular that the worship should be performed only by a Swami or a Brahmin." "It should not be that way," Maharaj said. "Anyone who has been initiated and who has entered the order is purified in his body and birth. Therefore, he should be allowed to do the worship." Then turning to me, he said, "You will do the worship." "But Maharaj," I replied, "I do not believe in ritualistic worship. I do not see the living presence in the picture. I am asking you to do the worship now." Maharaj said quietly, "Will you?" I obediently followed his instructions, and within a few days became convinced of the great efficacy of external worship. Almost his last advice to me was, "Be ritualistic." Now, I think anyone who has come to any of the Southern California centers has realized we are probably the most ritualistic of any centers outside of India. We are extremely ritualistic. And he added, "Look at Ambikananda, one of his senior disciples. See how wonderfully he is progressing through the practice of ritualism." This does not mean, however, that Maharaj asked everybody to practice ritualism. In fact, there are many of his devotees who have never learned the rites of formal worship. Hinduism teaches the value of ritual, but it does not say that it is essential to everyone's spiritual progress. I must mention two quotations which Maharaj never tired of repeating to his disciples. The first was, "Tell the truth, but never a harsh truth." The second was from the teachings of Sri Chaitanya. "Be humbler than a blade of grass. Be patient and forbearing like the tree. Take no honor to thyself. Give honor to all. Chant unceasingly the name of the Lord." I will conclude this chapter by giving an example of the way in which the guru power of Maharaj was manifested. Swami Vivekananda once remarked, "A real guru knows the past, present, and future of all of his disciples." Maharaj knew this about each one of us, as is shown in the following incident, which a monastic disciple describes. I was sitting cross-legged in front of Maharaj with his feet resting on my knees. This was the position in which I often used to massage his feet. Then something happened to me which I cannot explain, though I feel certain that it was Maharaj's doing. I found myself in a condition in which I was talking and talking, forgetting my usual restraint. It seemed to me that I spoke freely and even eloquently for a long time, but I do not remember what I said. Maharaj listened and said nothing. Suddenly, I returned to normal consciousness and became aware of Maharaj leaning toward me and asking me with an amused smile, "What did you say?" I then realized that I had addressed him as to me, the familiar form of you, which is used in speaking to equals and friends. I hastened to correct myself, repeating this sentence. I've forgotten what it was, but using apni, the respectful form of you by which we addressed him. At this, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation and sat upright again. I can only assume that Maharaj wanted to corroborate his own intuitive knowledge of my past lives, and that he therefore put me into this unusual state of consciousness in which I was able to tell him what he wanted to know. Next chapter, Mystic Visions. Okay. Maharaj once told me, were there any questions about any of that we just read, or any comments before we start the next chapter? Okay. Mystic visions. Maharaj once told me, there are times when it becomes impossible for me to teach anyone. No matter where I look, I see only God wearing many masks. Who am I, the teacher? Who is to be taught? How can God teach God? But when my mind comes down again to a lower level, I see the ignorance in man and I try to remove it. Maharaj spent most of his later life in a state of high spiritual consciousness, coming down only in order to teach and help us. His awareness of God had become so habitual that he would experience mystical visions even while conscious in the external world around him. He rarely spoke of these visions, and when he did so, it was only to his brother swamis or disciples. Vijnananda, a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, said of Maharaj and his visions, "The gods and goddesses are not myths, they are real. They are the many aspects of the one Godhead. I know this because Maharaj used to see and talk to them." I shall record a few of Maharaj's visions in this chapter. It was the year 1901, a few days before the annual worship of Durga, God the Mother in her aspect as protectress of the universe. Maharaj was sitting on the bank of the Ganges at the Bellarmont. Suddenly he saw Mother Durga walking on the surface of the Ganges toward the monastery grounds. She passed under the sacred vilva tree in the monastery garden and then disappeared. A moment later, Swamiji arrived by boat, came to Maharaj and said, "Raja, make arrangements at once for the worship of Mother Durga." Then he told Maharaj that he had a vision and had seen Mother Durga being worshipped at the monastery. Maharaj, in turn, described his own vision to Swamiji, and they began at once to prepare for the worship. Since that date, the special worship of Mother Durga has been held every year in the Bellar Monastery. Maharaj also performed this worship at the monasteries in Kankal, Benares, and Madras. He once told Akhilananda that he performed this worship in obedience to the Mother's direct command. Akhilananda records that during the Durga festival in Madras, the power of Maharaj was specially felt by his disciples, and their minds were raised to higher levels of spirituality. Maharaj used to observe Christmas every year by offering special worship to Jesus. The story of the Nativity was read aloud from the Bible and followed by meditation. Fruit, bread, cake, and wine were offered in the worship. I'll take a little break here. The first visit to India, when Bordaprana and I went in 1978, we attended the Christmas worship in Bellarmont. And it was one of the most charming things I've ever seen. They erected a special altar, and it was like, almost like it went up in steps like the grandstands at your high school, and each step was stepped back a little, and they had every single thing that they could find relating to Christianity and Christmas. There were pictures of Jesus, there were Christmas trees, there were Santa Clauses, there were Christmas carols sung, there were fruitcakes on it. It was absolutely one of the dearest and sweetest things I had ever seen in my life. And that stayed in the main shrine in Bellarmont, a side shrine, for the duration, I think it was about 4 days. Just adorable. And they sang Christmas carols, the way we sing bhajans. A little off timing, but it was also absolutely wonderful. Sister Devamata, an American devotee who happened to be present on one such occasion, records the scene as follows. When I had finished reading, the intense stillness in the air led me to look towards Swami Brahmananda. His eyes were open and fixed on the altar. There was a smile on his lips, but it was evident that his consciousness had gone to a higher plane. No one moved or spoke. At the end of 20 minutes or more, he took the look of immediate seeing returned to his eyes, and he motioned to us to continue the service. After the service, as Maharaj was partaking of the sacramental food, he remarked to Sister Devamata, "While you were reading, Christ suddenly stood before the altar, dressed in a long blue cloak. He talked to me for some time. It was a very blessed moment." Swami Vishwananda relates the following incident. One day, Ramnam was sung in Maharaj's small room at the Udbodhan office, where he was staying while Holy Mother was visiting her native village. There were only half a dozen people present. Maharaj was repeatedly in ecstasy. Sometimes his body shook, sometimes it was stiff. He uttered a few syllables expressing great joy. The place became surcharged with spiritual vibrations. I felt I was transported to another realm. When the singing was over, an attendant of Swami Brahmananda saluted Maharaj before taking his leave. As he bowed down to him, Maharaj exclaimed, "Foolish boy, where will you go now? What happened here was more than meditation." The implication was clear. Why should the brahmachari leave this spot where God consciousness was so tangible? This is what happens sometimes when we become more attached to our routines than to what is going on in the moment. We become so attached to our routine, it becomes an ego trip rather than imbibing the spirituality that is present. In Maharaj's presence, we understood the meaning of these words. The Guru expounds the texts of the scriptures in silence. The doubts of the disciples are dispelled. The Guru sees directly into the inner nature of the spiritual seeker and addresses himself to the aspirant's highest yearnings. On an afternoon of of a beautiful spring day in March 1916, a young Indian girl came to the monastery to see Maharaj. Forced into marriage by her parents, she had run away from her husband to the monastery. And as soon as she was brought into the presence of Maharaj, she fell at his feet, saying, "O Father, I have no desire to live a worldly life. I wish only to spend my days here at the monastery under your guidance. My one desire is to worship God and to realize Him. To Him alone I would surrender myself, body, mind, and soul." Deeply touched by her evident earnestness and guilelessness of character, Maharaj replied, "My child, this is a monastery. How can you stay here? Go back to your parents. They are worried about you. Stay with them, study the scriptures, and read the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. Pray to Sri Ramakrishna. He knows the yearnings of your heart and will answer your prayers. Later on, you may go to the Nivedita school for girls or to the ashrama of Gorima. You have the true understanding. Vain indeed is this human birth unless one has love for God." But the young girl refused to return to her parents' home. So Maharaj blessed her and sent her to the ashrama. After she had left, Maharaj walked slowly into the library, where he found Swami Brahmananda writing a letter. He sat down beside him and almost immediately went into a mood of ecstasy. Those who watched him could catch only a glimpse of the ecstatic joy which shone through his radiant face. His expression and behavior were indescribable. Swami Brahmananda watched him for a while, then turning to the young monk who was also present, said, "Watch Maharaj. That mood in which you see him is known as the Paramahamsa state." In a little while, Maharaj returned to normal consciousness and said to Swami Brahmananda, "Who can understand the divine play of Sri Ramakrishna?" Swami Vivekananda wanted to see a convent established for young women, and now I see that someday, soon, his desire will be fulfilled. Young women are becoming imbued with the ideal of renunciation as taught by our Master. That girl who came today was like a goddess in her beauty, her purity, her earnestness, and her guilelessness. Okay. We're going to go on a little bit of a pilgrimage before we finish. There is a saying in Sanskrit, places of pilgrimage are made holy by the visits of the seers of God. The enlightened soul does not need to visit holy places or temples, for he has realized the living God everywhere. Wherever he lives, that place becomes holy. Nevertheless, we know that enlightened men often journey to shrines and temples. They do so because they find there a greater manifestation of God, a more concentrated revelation, as it were. This spiritual concentration has been caused by the visits of many holy men and women, and by the devotion of pilgrims throughout the ages. When a saint goes to a holy place, he contributes his own revelation to the spiritual treasure house for the benefit of the generations that will follow. The temple, this explains why you feel a certain mood when you enter a temple or a holy place. No matter what the denomination is, you can feel the mood of the place. The temples of India are dedicated to deities of many forms and aspects, as well as to the impersonal, formless Godhead. This one Godhead, whose name is Silence, comprises all divine forms and aspects, yet is beyond form and definition. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, never set a limit to the infinite by trying to define it. And indeed, it is evident that the infinite God must have infinite forms of expression. Truth is one. Sages call it by various names, says the Rig Veda, the ancient scripture of the Hindus. In an orchestra, different instruments play different notes, but when the notes are harmonized, the combined effect is of one beautiful unity. Maharaj reached this unity through his realization of Brahman. An ordinary mystic may be aware of only one instrument and hear only one note, one part or aspect of the divine whole. The illumined soul, however, hears all the instruments, the entire orchestra. Thus it was that Maharaj, while ever conscious of the one Brahman, was able to see the many divine aspects when he visited the temples dedicated to them. At Madura, in southern India, there is a famous temple of Divine Mother. When Maharaj entered it and stood before the deity, he exclaimed, "Mother, Mother," and lost his external consciousness. Swami Ramakrishna Order, who was with him, saw his condition and held him by the arms to prevent him from falling. Seeing Maharaj standing unconscious in ecstasy, the priests and devotees who were present gazed at him in silence. An intense stillness pervaded the temple and lasted for more than an hour. When Maharaj regained his normal consciousness, he went silently away. Later, he described his vision of the luminous form of Divine Mother. At the temple of Rameshwar, which is dedicated to Shiva, the formless aspect of God, Maharaj was again absorbed in samadhi. Even after he returned to normal consciousness, he remained for some time in a state of ecstatic joy. The temple at Cape Cormoran is dedicated to Divine Mother in the form of a little girl. Maharaj lived there for several days. For a while he would stand silent and motionless before the deity. Then he would become ecstatic and begin to talk to her. Whenever he entered this temple, he lost all external consciousness. In the temple of Vishnu at Tirupati in southern India, Maharaj had a strange experience. The vision he beheld there was not of Vishnu, but of Divine Mother. On inquiry, it was found that the temple had once been dedicated to Mother, and later had been changed into a Vishnu temple through the influence of Ramanuja. In the temple of Jagannath at Puri, there are 3 images. Krishna stands on one side, his brother Balaram on the other, and Subhadra, their sister, stands in the center. Here, Maharaj once saw the living Krishna on the altar. The 3 images had disappeared. Maharaj visited this temple many times, and each time he went there, he seemed to dwell in another realm, and his face shone with a radiant smile. Of the many places of pilgrimage that Maharaj visited, he loved Vrindavan and Benares most of all. He used to tell us that in these 2 cities a spiritual current is always flowing, and that this current grows particularly strong at certain times of the day and night. He said that if a man meditates and practices japa in Vrindavan at midnight, he is greatly helped by the spiritual current. And if he meditates in Benares at 4 o'clock in the morning, he may easily become absorbed into the higher consciousness. In later years, when Maharaj visited the temples at Vrindavan and Benares, he would ask his disciples to sing and chant, and he himself would go into samadhi. Speaking of Benares, he said, many have found enlightenment there. If the aspirant struggles a little to reach union with God, he may get it very easily. Only once did Maharaj initiate a disciple in Benares. After that, he refused to do so because he said, Lord Shiva gives liberation to all those who live and die there. A disciple who later became Swami Akhilananda was once in Benares with Maharaj and wanted initiation. Holy Mother does not initiate any disciple in Benares, Maharaj told him. I have made the same rule. Then, in a sweet, affectionate voice, he added, I will initiate you when I go back to the monastery at Belur. Don't be impatient. In my mind, I have already accepted you as my disciple and have made myself responsible for you. I think we'll stop there. He goes back to Belur and we'll continue with mystic visions. Yeah, I'll read 2 more chapters because it stops on the other page. Once during the celebration of Sri Ramakrishna's birthday at Belur, while the disciples were singing and chanting, Maharaj went into samadhi. He was carried to his room completely unconscious of the outer world, his face shining with a heavenly radiance. He remained in this condition so long that his brother disciples became anxious. They told Holy Mother, who was present at the time, but she showed no anxiety. Indeed, she seemed well pleased and said, Do not worry about him. Then she went to Maharaj, touched his arm lightly, and said in an affectionate voice, Rakal, I have brought sacramental food for you. Eat, my child. Maharaj immediately returned to normal consciousness, and seeing Holy Mother, prostrated himself at her feet. He used to say, It is very hard to understand Mother's greatness unless she herself reveals it. Through the grace of Sri Ramakrishna, one may recognize the Divine Mother in her. Once, while Maharaj was visiting Holy Mother, a female disciple of Sri Ramakrishna said to him, Rakal, Mother wanted to know from you why a spiritual aspirant must worship the Divine Mother first. Maharaj answered, Mother has the key to the knowledge of Brahman. Unless she shows her grace and opens the door, no one can enter into the realm of Brahman. As he left the house where Holy Mother was staying, Maharaj began to sing and dance, clapping his hands like a little boy. Whenever he was with Holy Mother, he always acted in this childlike manner which expressed the relationship between them. And we will stop there. If there are any questions or comments. Okay, we'll end with the chant. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.